So following the success of my previous video on an Amazon virtual onsite and the recommendation from someone actually applying for a Facebook PM role to read Louis Lynn's Secrets of the Product Manager's book, also linked in video description, I actually found an example in that book of an hypothetical interview for a PM role, and it basically contains the steps and the core competencies and the leadership principles that he recommended in the book. And I wanted to add a bit more to that information with more specific questions and also a little bit more insight. So, by the way, I also included these in a diagram, which I also included at the end of the video if you want to have an overall picture of this whole thing later on, or for your role play if you want. So without further ado, let's just get straight into the virtual onsite. So this is basically containing 4 different interviewers, starting with the bar raiser, and the bar raiser would hypothetically screen you on 2 leadership principles, on customer obsession and on invent and simplify. Now, what are some good questions for a PM role when it comes to customer obsession? In my opinion, can you think of an improvement or fix that you made in order to meet the needs of your customers? This would be the first one. And the second one would be, tell me about the time when you were unclear about the customer's request. What step did you take to clarify things, right? So notice here the start with the customers and work backwards, from the leadership principle. And when it comes to invent and simplify, tell me about the radical approach you proposed to solve a big problem. Explain why it was significant and how you went about it, right? So this is the question, but even more interestingly, the follow-up questions to take into account here. How did you get everyone on board? And what was your approach successful? I believe it should, by the way, in such questions. How did you measure value of the project? What would you do differently? Or what other options could be considered here? So notice here also the follow-up questions are something that in some cases are even more interesting. And from my experience, the bar raiser is oftentimes the one that will have a tendency to dive deeper than other interviewers in such now virtual on-sites. Let's take another question here. Can you give me an example of how you drew new thinking and innovation out of a team member that led to a specific innovation? And how do you make this repeatable? I believe that that's a very interesting follow-up question to take into account. So this would be the first round, the bar raiser round. And notice here, I took 2 leadership principles and 2 examples of questions. I believe this is an average number of questions that you might get in a job interview, maybe even less, because I give you 4. So I would say 2, 3 is where you're actually going to be most of the time. But it's not excluded that you're going to get more than this in a job interview. So don't take it as a rule that you're only going to get this number of questions. These are just examples to help you to guide you through the process and to test your knowledge ultimately on how would you go with your best possible answers. Next, with the hiring manager. And this is, again, a very important part of the virtual interviews. Learn and be curious first. Tell me something interesting you've learned recently. Or the second question would be, describe a time when you were challenged to think differently in order to find a better solution to a problem. So again, this is on learn and be curious. I believe these are the best questions I know, at least for this principle. Now, when it comes to have backbone, disagree, and commit, tell me about the time when you had an idea that was refused support by upper management. So a time when you pitched something unsuccessfully. And by the way, the most common question for have backbone, disagree, and commit, a time when you disagree with your manager. I didn't include it here because I include it so many times on my YouTube channel. And just one more example here. Tell me about the time when you raised an uncomfortable issue in an internal meeting, right? So have backbone. And this is the principle. So this will be the main questions on have backbone, disagree, and commit. And the third leadership principle, with the note here that usually you only gonna get tested on 2 leadership principles, to my knowledge. So, but we take this hypothetical scenario as in the book. Earn trust. Tell me about the time when you received tough feedback from your manager. How did you respond? So time when you receive tough feedback from a manager, right? So it's earn trust. It's very, very important when talking about interpersonal skills and working in teams in general. How do you communicate change when you know it will be a tough sell, right? Communicating change in a context of earn trust. I believe it rhymes perfectly. The thing is, from experience, the challenge is spotting the principle when they're actually talking about earn trust here. So that's why I believe the answer becomes so much better if you know what they're looking for. So just as a tip here. The next interviewing round would be with a product manager. They would test you this time on an ability, let's say analytical ability. In this case, notice it's not a specific principle, but your ability to do the job, right? And the questions that I picked here: describe a time when you had to solve a problem but didn't have all the necessary information about it in hand. Right? So this is a behavioral question to test your analytical ability. How to weigh in pros and cons before making a decision. Right? So this is also a behavioral question, but it could also be interpreted as a hypothetical question. What I want you to also understand is that on my channel, I share about behavioral questions and leadership in general. So when it comes to product manager interview, you're also going to get some product specific types of questions, which also include later in the video, but you should keep in mind that this is primarily targeted for the behavioral part of the interview, right? Just keep this in mind. And the second part of the product manager interview would be on think big. Tell me about the time when you came up with a new approach to something that was already working because you saw the bigger picture, right? This is a standard think big type of question. And the second one would be, tell me about the time when you were successfully pitched an idea to global stakeholders. So how you sold an idea to global stakeholders. Notice it's think big, but if you remember, it could also be a matter of earned trust. So these would be maybe interchangeable as well. And the last round of the interview would be with the technical program manager, the fourth round. Now, from experience, there will be usually 4, 5, even 6 rounds of interviews, but I'd like to stick with this example because I wanted to give you examples for you to train yourself on, right? So the fourth round would be a technical program manager, and this would be actually based on your ability to do the job. First would be questions around requirements gathering. What methods do you use when creating product roadmaps and developing overall strategy? Right. So notice here, this is not necessarily a behavioral question. It's a very PM specific type of question. Or a time when the project requirements were not clear. Think of a time when the project requirements were not clear and how do you go about clarifying these. Now, this is a behavioral question, so it could be a mix of both, but from experience, technical people in job interviews will not prefer asking you behavioral questions unless they have to. So when preparing for interviewing with someone technical, you'd rather prepare the non-behavioral questions first, especially for a PM role, because they will be told by HR or by the hiring manager to ask a few behavioral questions. But primarily they're interested in the PM types of questions. Now, when it comes to problem solving, describe a situation at work when you are faced with a problem you could not solve. Right, so notice here on problem solving, I also chose a behavioral questions. And finally, the analytical abilities. To test your analytical abilities, and a question specific to someone applying for a finance related role. How would you price the next Kindle? So this is actually one of the best PM questions that I know at Amazon. Or if Amazon ran out of stock for a popular item such as a game console, what should the company do once customers realize it's out of stock? Right, so this is another PM specific type of question. And by the way, I took this from, I think it's Dominic Black's Product Manager's book. I also linked this one in the video description if you want to take a closer look on these, again, specifically PM types of questions. And finally, still on analytical abilities, but I'd rather pick also a behavioral question here. Describe a time when you had to solve a problem but didn't have all the necessary information about it in hand. Right, so I believe this is a behavioral question, but it could easily turn out to be a very technical exploration. As soon as you give the details, you give a succinct, a star answer if you want, about your specific project, but then it could easily go into a technical exploration. So these would be the questions, the hypothetical interview questions and experience. Hopefully you'll find this useful, and thank you very much for watching.